All right, thanks for joining us. Another episode of the Deals for Dentists podcast. And today we have David Harris, who's zooming in from Halifax, Canada. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, so David Harris's company is called Prosperident, which specializes in dental embezzlement. And you can go to Deals for Dentists and find his promo listing, which is get 10% fee reduction on all his services. So thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. And I want to clarify one thing right away. We don't specialize in embezzlement. We specialize in the investigation of embezzlement. Other people do it. We just see what happens.
That's a good clarification. Yeah.
Well, just in case anybody took the wrong idea from this.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, David, I'm going to read off the letters after your name. This could take me a while. You're a CFE, a CPA, a CMA, FCPA, CFF, and an MBA. So I know what a CPA and an MBA are, but what are all the other letters behind your name?
They're mostly investigation credentials. So CFE is Certified Fraud Examiner. FCPA is Forensic CPA. And CFF is Certified in Financial Forensics.
You should just change it to BA for badass, because that's a lot of specialties in education that you have there.
Well, don't take it too seriously. I was playing a poker game and won a lot of post-nominals one day.
There you go. Hey, you'll take it. So how did you first get involved in helping dental offices?
It was completely by accident. I was doing investigation for a bank. I had quit my job one day and I was sitting at home and had my feet up watching TV and, just not thinking about very much. And the phone rang and it was a guy I knew from high school who was now a dentist. And he said to me, I think my front desk person's stealing from me and I don't have anyone else to call. And he caught me at the absolute right time. It was the middle of August. This is before there was such a thing as a PVR. There was nothing good on TV. And of course, no Netflix, nothing very exciting happening. So he caught me at the right moment and I said, no problem. I'll meet you tonight at work at your practice after it closes and we'll get to the bottom of what's going on. So I went to his practice. I saw what she was doing. This, to put the chronology in place, Eric, this was 1989. So in those days, practices were not computerized. They used to use this old manual system called pegboard. So I was looking at the pegboard and I hadn't really seen it before, but it all kind of made sense. And I saw what she was doing. And my friend asked me to come back in the next morning when the thief would be there because he wanted me to kind of be a witness to firing her. So I did that. And I walked away and he promised to buy me dinner. That still hasn't happened. But, and I didn't really see a career for myself. I just kind of thought that was interesting. 2 weeks later, everything changed. And the catalyst was that I was going into my own dentist office for an appointment. And just imagine what went through my head when I had my hand up on his front door and I was about to go in. And I looked through the glass partition in the door and sitting at my dentist's front desk was the same woman I helped fire 2 weeks before. So I said something I wouldn't repeat in polite company as I sprinted to the nearest payphone, because in those days, cell phones were like the size of a briefcase, and called the office and got put through on a little bit of a pretext to the doctor and told him about the time bomb ticking loudly away at his front desk. And he hired me on the spot. And that was how I got started.
And you've been working with dental offices ever since? Any other health professions or just dental offices?
No, we limit ourselves to dentists. Everybody who works at Prosperident, there are about 25 of us now. We all have dental backgrounds of some type. About 40% of our investigators used to be dentists. And the rest were software trainers, office managers, consultants. They've all had some kind of dental background. One of our rising stars used to be a hygienist before she saw the light and came to work with us.
Speaking of Netflix, I smell Netflix show here. You could, half of what's on Netflix is unwatchable, but you know, you investigating financial crimes and dental offices, I'm in. I'm watching that series. So um, I smell dollar signs here for you. Um, and now, although, in doing that and us even having this conversation, we don't want to give the thieves out there a playbook, right? I mean,
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, most of them already have that playbook.
mm,
And one of the things I tell dentists who are victims, and I had a call this morning from somebody who realized yesterday that her office manager of about 8 years has her hand in the doctor's cookie jar. And one thing I tell doctors very early on about this is that it's not exactly a level playing field. The thief has a lot of advantages. One is research, and there's a prodigious amount of information on how to do this on the internet. None of which I hasten to add was put there by me. But there's lots and lots of information on how to solve the various problems that a thief has.
so is there like a group forum discussion out there for thieves? Like, or is this just
There are a few of those. There's a
really?
chat line I belong to for convicted felons,
Uh-huh.
and I am not a convicted felon, although I did have some legal difficulties in my teens.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, there's a chat line there, and one of their discussion points is how do you get a job with a criminal record? And one of the answers is go work at a dental office because they don't do background checks.
Are dentists, are we the only suckers out there? Are we just like you said, just a higher target? Like, are other, types of businesses and other health professions and getting embezzled as much as dentists?
Other health professions, yeah, probably. Do dentists get embezzled more than non-healthcare small business owners? Yes, they do. And I think there are probably a couple of factors going on there. But if you look at kind of global embezzlement statistics, who gets embezzled? The big three are government, charities, and healthcare. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. But one of the big ones is that, and if you take government as a leading example, one of the things that government misses that most businesses have is an exchange of money for goods or services. In other words, when I go to the car dealership and I buy a car, um, if somebody's wondering if money's missing, one of the possibilities open to them is, well, how many cars were sold last year, and what's kind of our normal markup on a car, and what expenses do we have? And so, somebody who has a forensic bent should be able to more or less reconstruct how much money the car dealership should have made. What government does, and I guess by extension also what charities do, is a little bit different. They take money from one group and give it to a different group. So they don't have that exchange. Dentistry has it, but it's imperfect. And the imperfections are, first of all, they're not selling inventory. So, it's not like you could count the number of crowns that you sold last year and figure out how much income you had, unless all you did was crowns. And the other problem is insurance. Because now you have third parties paying for the majority of what happens in a dental practice, in most practices. And that, again, kind of clouds the basic economic relationship. So you have that stuff going on one side. And on the other side, I will say gently that I know very few of your peers who ended up as dentists because they really wanted to own a business.
Right.
For every dentist I've ever met, that's just kind of this horrible byproduct of doing what you want to do.
And we come out with no business training, no education on the business side of things. We come out, totally raw in that aspect.
That's true. I'm not sure there's an easy solution. I mean, I've heard a lot of people say, well, dental schools should teach more business courses. And my question is always, okay, so what do you want them to drop in exchange?
Right.
We stop teaching people how to do crowns? Should we? A lot of people say dentures would be a good candidate to get rid of, but I don't see that happening. So, they have a certain number of hours, and they're pretty much used up. The other thing I'll say is I teach at 4 or 5 dental schools sometimes, and the students just aren't quite ready for the business stuff. I mean, what if you were going to design the ideal dental education, I'd say to people, okay, go out and practice for 2 years and then come back and we're going to do your business course, because then you'll be ready.
Right.
When I talk to you about your receivables, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about those rotten people who got dentistry and haven't paid you yet.
Hmm.
On the other hand, you talk to a room full of D4s about receivables, and what's going through their mind is, does that mean that somebody owes me money or I owe them money?
Right.
And they just can't quite put it into context.
Yeah, they just want to graduate too.
Yeah, and they're thinking about doing their boards and finding a place to work and dealing with that mountain of debt that they have, and these little niceties about how to run the practice aren't something they really have a lot of headspace for anyway.
Now, you mentioned, back in the 80s, the pegboard system, was it easier to embezzle then, with all the technology now and the practice management softwares? Is it easier now, or is it just thieves just, go with the times and they get more sophisticated as the technology gets more sophisticated?
It is way easier now.
Mhm.
Technology is a huge enabler of embezzlement. And what happened, and I doubt you ever worked in pegboard, but for those in your audience for whom it's a distant memory, you could be fairly unknowledgeable about business and look at your pegboard stuff and have a decent idea of what was going on. You also were looking at original transactions. I mean, you could see the handwriting of who made entries, for example. And when practice is computerized, there was, first of all, a big subset of the dental population who just decided, I can't be bothered learning about that computer system that's running in my practice. I mean, really, that's my staff's job.
Mhm.
And I say to people, fundamentally, that's as important to your financial well-being as your handpiece. And there's really no reason that one should be like your child and the other should be like a foreign language. So computerization allowed some dentists to kind of isolate themselves from the finances. And the other thing is, when you look at what your computer generates, it's reports, and really reports are an abstraction of transactions. So now you're looking at aggregation instead of the individual stuff. And that created a whole host of opportunities for thieves.
And who's creating that report? Is it, is it the embezzler, or is it the
Well, that's a very salient question.
yeah.
One of the pieces of advice that I give dentists is the reports that you rely on should be ones that you printed.
Right.
If you let somebody else print them, you have abdicated control over the assumptions underlying those reports. And it's very easy to hide stuff when you're the person printing reports. So, I know this news won't be welcome to some of your audience, but if you want to make sure that your reports have integrity, you need to print them.
Now, what about, fee for service office versus an office that has multiple, in-network plans? As you add more insurance companies and more in-network plans, it just creates more of a web. Where is that more opportunity for embezzlers?
I think they each have their own opportunity, and I'm not sure there's more in one place than the other. If you are a fee for service office, that means, first of all, you tend to take in a higher percentage of your revenue in cash.
Mhm.
And cash is not the only way to steal. I mean, a lot of dentists think of theft as being theft of cash, and cash is the first choice of every thief, but if there's not enough cash coming in, they'll find something else. So, fee for service practices tend to be cash heavy. And the doctors also tend to disengage themselves a little bit more from the financial operations of the practice, because in the mind of the doctor, this is kind of foolproof. I mean, people come in, they have treatment, they pay. I don't have receivables. I don't have to deal with insurance claims that have bounced and have to be resubmitted. And if you run a fee for service practice, for example, you might not even think it's important to look at a receivables report. Um, so there's a mindset that goes with fee for service that sometimes gets people in trouble. On the other hand, when you deal with insurance and especially multiple PPOs, then you have adjustments flying around like candy leaves my house at Halloween, and you've got multiple fee schedules conceivably and copays, and the financial operation gets a lot more complex, and in complexity comes the ability to hide stuff.
What about the overall size of the office? If I'm a solopreneur and I have a small staff versus, a large practice or a multi-location office, how does that affect the probability of getting embezzled?
Good question. I'm not sure really it does. And, one of the misconceptions, and I think this conversation, Eric, is kind of taking us in that direction. So let's tackle it head on. One of the misconceptions is that more opportunity equals more theft.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure that's always true. I think thieves in general are responding to their own pressures first. And the question of which pipelines are open to them in your practice really affects the how more than the if. So when I steal, I do it because I'm pushed by some demons. And sometimes they're financial, sometimes they're emotional, but they're pretty powerful. So I'm one of your employees, and I wake up one morning and I say, today's the day I'm going to steal from Dr. Block. And I make that decision without spending a whole lot of time thinking about, well, can I get away with it? Will he catch me? What's the best way to do it? After I've decided to do it, now I start thinking about the how. And that's where I'm looking for opportunity. And it's really binary. I mean, either there's a way for me to steal or there isn't. And if I've decided that I'm going to, and there's an open doorway, I will steal. Thieves have lots of choices. I mean, we see lots of stuff. Some of it is jaw-droppingly creative. Some of it's very mundane, and it just depends on what's available in a specific practice. And I'll give you an example of this. There are two kinds of dentists out there. There are those who review their reports at the end of the day and check that the bank deposit lines up with the reports. And there are those who don't do any of that. In my experience, the two cohorts are about equal size. If you are in the second group, so if you're in the group who don't know how much your deposit should be today, the way that I'm going to steal from you is simply to pilfer from the deposit. And it doesn't matter whether I make the bank deposit or you do. The real operative question is, do you know what amount should be there? And do you confirm that that's what went into the bank? If you're in the first cohort, the group who do watch this like a hawk, then if I'm your office manager, what that means is the way for me to steal is to make the software lie about how much money came in today. So stealing is a dynamic, or I guess an interactive process. And the thief has a huge advantage because they know what cards are in your hand. It's almost like you and I playing poker, and your cards are face up and mine are hidden. And if we play like that for a while, I'm going to walk away from that night with a whole lot of your money. This isn't much different.
Now, playing like that for a while, how long does it typically take someone to figure out your system? Is it months? Is it weeks?
The determinant is this something they've done before? So we see people who are called serial embezzlers, and these are people who work in a practice and they steal and they get caught and they get fired, and 2 weeks later they're working across the street. And if we have time today, I'll talk about lax hiring practices the dentists follow. But these folks, when they get into the next practice, they're kind of like a piranha looking for blood in the water. And their sort of acclimatization period can be as short as a couple of weeks.
Mhm.
And typically it's a month or so. I think
Wow.
in a lot of cases, when you're interviewing somebody who is one of these serial embezzlers, at the same time you're doing that, they're kind of reverse interviewing you. They're they're asking themselves in that interview, how hard is this guy going to be
Mhm.
to steal money from? And then you have the other group who, I guess, for a really horrible expression, are virgins, and their their period of acclimatization could be more or less forever. Some we've seen embezzlers who have worked in a practice for 20 years before they started stealing. Now, the day they decide to do it, they know exactly what to do. But they've sat there for a long, long, long time, and just one day suddenly decided to steal.
What's the psychology behind stealing? Does something happen in their life, or where they just, got greedy one day, or, they need the money? What's the psychology there?
People steal really for two reasons, and I call them need and greed, and you just covered them nicely. Needy people have something going on in their life that's turned their finances upside down. And the classic cases of this, husband loses his job, or you have somebody working for you who's going through a divorce and suddenly is finding out that it's hard to support two households and pay a bunch of attorney bills on the income that used to keep one household going. So those are needy people, and in a lot of cases, the wolf is kind of at their door, and maybe they're behind in their mortgage, or their car's about to be repossessed or something like that. So they're really stealing to put food on the table. And in a lot of cases, they feel bad about it, but they just don't see an option. The other group we call greedy thieves, and greedy thieves are stealing to address an ego deficit. So they tend to look at their doctor as this high functioning moron with good hands. And Dr. Block, the only reason that you're successful is because I keep your chair full, and when people leave, I collect the money. And they forget some things. I mean, they forget how long you spent in school and how much debt you exited with, and those first couple of years as a dentist when you hardly made any money. None of that factors in. They just look at this as, we should really be partners, and you just aren't paying me what I'm worth, and I'm going to take it from you.
Mhm.
And there's an element of sociopathy there. A lot of these folks tend to have a narcissistic streak. And there's an emerging body of research that suggests that they are, the psychologists even have a term for this: narcissistic sociopaths. In other words, they have characteristics of both of those things. And they tend to fit the profile of the greedy thief. When the greedy thieves steal, Eric, they flaunt the money. I mean, again, they're doing this for an ego deficit. So the greedy thieves, sorry, the needy people, the ones behind financially, I mean, they're paying the mortgage. The greedy thieves will buy expensive clothes. They'll have cosmetic surgery. They'll buy a BMW. They'll take luxury vacations. I mean, they really will do things that they would never do with money they earned. And, it's that narcissistic thing. Another pressure that drives some of these people is, they went to college with people who now own businesses, or went on to professional schools, and their friends are far more successful than they are, and stealing lets them feel like they're doing okay too. One of our alumni, as we call them, actually chartered a plane, and she took 7 of her friends to New York on a shopping trip. And the friends typically were earning more money than she was, and this is kind of her way of waving the flag and saying, yeah, I'm successful too.
There's a lot of different motivations and reasons. So you mentioned hiring. Is there a behavioral assessment that you can give to applicants to weed out these narcissists, or are dentists just not calling previous employers or checking criminal records? What's the disconnect there?
I don't think there's a behavioral assessment that will do this. And I've had several companies who are in the psychometrics business come to me and say, we have something that would screen these people out. The problem with any psychometric test is that as it assumes that the person answering it wants to be measured and is answering honestly. In other words, questions designed to find narcissism are pretty, there's no stealth or subterfuge there. You can, if you look at the test, you understand exactly what the questions are going after. So the people taking these tests will lie. And that kind of collapses the validity of the underlying metrics. To answer the second part of your question, dentistry has allowed itself to get out of step with how the rest of America hires. I can't get a job at FedEx delivering the stuff people buy on Amazon without a drug test.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I can probably work in more than 90% of the offices of the people in the audience. That makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not suggesting a drug test is the cure for all of the evils that you might hire, but it just illustrates a point. Dentists are healers first and business people second, and they tend to be incurable optimists in the sense that they want to see the best in everybody. And if I had a drug problem, I can't think of a better place to work than a dental practice. Except maybe a perio practice or an oral surgery practice, because prescriptions move out of there pretty fast. But FedEx won't hire people without a drug test, and yet dentists who have prescription pads in every operatory will.
Right.
Criminal records check, which you mentioned, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give a sobering statistic to your audience. Over 60 million Americans, so that's roughly 1 in 4 adults, has a criminal record.
Wow.
Not all those criminal records would necessarily stop me from hiring somebody, but that's a decision I should make based on knowledge, not just kind of putting the blinders on and hiring. Former employers are vital, and the rule should be very simple. You need to talk with everybody that somebody has worked for in the past 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to add a little tip for the audience as well. Do not call any phone number that an applicant gives you, because if you do, you may end up speaking to their uncle who's pretending to be their last employer.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody says that they work for Dr. Eric Block, Google's really cheap to use. Go online, find the phone number, and then you know you're actually speaking with Dr. Block. A few other things that people should be doing. One thing I would not do in 2021 is hire somebody without taking a look at their social networking activity. So what am I looking for? Well, the first thing I'm looking for is anti-employer sentiment. The person who says, I hate my job, my boss is a jerk, is going to be saying that about you pretty soon. Next thing I look at is time of day when people post. And if they post during working hours, you're about to hire a time thief. And all of your other staff will be complaining about these people as they take extended bathroom breaks so they can catch up with their friends. This one's probably a little bit of a sensitive topic right now, but really strongly held political beliefs might concern me. I don't necessarily want people coming into my office, regardless of how I may have voted, with a MAGA shirt on, because that's likely to offend some of my patients.
That's such great advice to check with all the previous employers and not trust the number that was put on that on that resume. find the previous employers and Google their number and talk to them and check that social media. I think those are, such great tips. Would it be weird if I had a polygraph at every interview? Would that be strange?
Since you bring it up, polygraphy is pretty much disavowed now as a valid technique.
Hmm.
One of the problems that it has is that it doesn't work well with sociopaths.
Hmm.
In other words, what polygraph does is it captures physiological response to lying. What sociopaths do is they kind of rewrite the truth in their minds. So they don't tend to have those responses when they lie because they've already convinced themselves that it's the truth. So the exact people who can beat a polygraph are the ones you don't want to hire. So I know it was a facetious question, but it really doesn't, it wouldn't help.
Okay, I'll leave that out of my standard interviewing process.
Good plan.
So, what do you think the percentage of dental offices right now are being embezzled?
I'll kind of give a little bit of a circuitous answer to that if I can. The probability that you will be a victim at some point in your career is about 80%. When you divide that by the number of years that the typical dentist practices, and then multiply it by the duration of typical embezzlement, because most embezzlement goes on for about 2 years, what comes out is there's probably 10 to 15% of your audience is probably being embezzled today.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, does this number go up as the number of employees in your practice go up versus you just or is it you have that one employee that is the ideal employee, you think everything's great, and the red flags like they're staying late or they want to work alone or they don't let anyone touch their computer. But does that get, let's say a practice has so many employees, they're working in shifts and they're sharing workstations, does that get harder to embezzle?
I'd say overall it gets easier.
Hmm.
If we're measuring raw probability, the bigger the practice, the more likely it is that embezzlement's going to happen. And at the extreme end, if you look at big DSOs, and we do work for companies that own more than 400 or 500 practices, they get embezzled too, which surprises not only a lot of solo dentists, but some of these DSOs. I mean, they just assume that because we're big, we must also be smart.
Right.
And that's not always the case. So embezzlement happens at every size of practice. If you have 5 locations and 75 employees, the chance of you being embezzled this year is definitely bigger than if you had one practice with 4 employees. Okay, because the probability among those 75 employees of having a rotten apple is much bigger. And I spoke a few years back at an association of dental group practice owners. So these were people who owned 5 or more practices. And I was sitting with 7 of them at breakfast one morning, and I didn't start this, but one of them said, okay, we're going to just go around the table and do a survey. And what I want to know is not if you've been embezzled, because I know you all have. What I want to know is how many times. So the guy next to me kind of started this. So we went around the table, and the average among these 7 guys was 3 times. And they all finished the sentence with the words that I know of. So, I've been hit 3 times as far as I know, because obviously there's, the getting at the true statistics is a bit of a challenge because some of it never gets found out.
What kind of money are we talking about here? What's the average amount that is embezzled?
The average is a little over 100,000.
Wow.
The biggest I've ever seen is around 2 million.
Wow.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, unbelievable. And that was from not a huge practice. It was a 2-doctor practice, and that
Now,
happened over about 8 years.
are some types of practices like orthodontists more are they hit more than like a GP or a pediatric, or what's your experience with that?
I'll go back to what I said before, that embezzlement is not really opportunity driven. You know, it happens because somebody who works for you gets this idea in their head that they would be better off if they stole from you. And what really drives the probability is the chance of hiring somebody who is either already dishonest or in the right set of circumstances could get there.
Mhm.
And you know that really doesn't it doesn't correlate to any specific type of practice. In other words, an orthodontist has just as much chance of having one of those people working for her as a prosthodontist does.
Mhm.
And so there's no, you know, there's no discernible pattern. Um, I will say that a slightly when we compare our client mix with um, kind of how dental specialties are distributed, orthodontists represent a significantly higher percentage of our client mix than you'd think. I mean, about 6% of dentists are orthodontists, and they're about 9 or 9.5% of our client base.
Wow.
I have no explanation for that except that we have some really good connections in the orthodontic world, and I think we've been successful at getting the message out to them, and they're maybe a little more on their guard than the rest of dentistry.
Now, what is it that causes suspicion, and how what creates that eureka moment where they make that phone call to you?
A lot of times it's behavioral. And you know, when you think about how embezzlement gets discovered, it happens in one of two ways. There's either some kind of financial discovery. And I mentioned that I had a call this morning from a dentist who had caught embezzlement. And what gave it away for her was that a patient came in and paid a fair amount of cash. And at the end of the day, the cash wasn't there.
Mhm.
So that's a financial discovery of embezzlement. Behavioral happens when you have the person who doesn't want to take vacation, or you have somebody who is a real control freak and sort of tries to chase everybody away from their job and won't cross train people, maybe even gets upset if somebody sits at their desk. That's an example of a behavioral discovery. We've looked extensively at how embezzlement is discovered, and what comes out is a little bit startling. About 70% of dentists who have a problem realize that because of how the thief is acting. In other words, you're about twice as likely to clue in because of behavioral stuff than financial stuff, which I think is contrary to what a lot of dentists have been led to believe over the years, which is just, you know, if you watch your numbers closely enough, you'll find us. I think the opposite answer is true. If you watch your employees closely enough, you're more likely to find it.
Watch their behaviors. So if all of a sudden they don't want to take vacation, or they want to work nights or weekends, and they're getting very territorial over their computers, these are some major red flags.
Those are major red flags. What I would caution your audience on is overreacting to any one specific
Hmm.
behavior. And the example I always give, my dad's an attorney. He's currently 87 years old. He wound down his practice about 2 years ago. So he practiced to age 85. In the last 7 or 8 years he was practicing, he never took a vacation. I'm pretty sure he wasn't embezzling from his law firm. What was going on was that my mom wasn't in great health and she really couldn't travel. So if my dad took vacation, what it meant was he'd be stuck home with my mom. And their marriage was built around limiting the amount of time they spent together. And he
Hmm.
just wasn't going to push the envelope. So, you know, I wouldn't necessarily find any one phenomenon that makes me say, that person must be stealing. On the other hand, when you have the person who doesn't want to take vacation and, you know, they are disproportionately influential in picking the advisors of the practice. And they do what's called a conspicuous display of honesty. When somebody makes a point of showing you how honest they are, when you start lining up 3 or 4 things like that, yeah, the alarm bell should be ringing pretty loudly in your head.
But some dentists may see this as what they think is the ideal employee, right?
I hear this a lot. She's my best employee. She comes in early, she
Yeah.
stays late, she's never sick, she never takes vacation. Okay, stop and listen to yourself. Employees are paid on salary, typically. I mean, some are hourly. Most offices pay salary. Um, People tend to behave in their own self-interest. So if I'm working an extra 15 hours a week and I'm not being paid for it, sooner or later, if I'm self-interested, I'm going to come back to you and say, Dr. Block, I love being your office manager and I take a lot of pride in the job I do, but I'm being paid for 37 hours a week and on average I'm working 55. Could we do something to close the gap? And if I go 3 years and I don't have that conversation with you, either I view you as a charity case, which seems a little unreasonable for to treat somebody who makes, in my perception, 5 times or 10 times what I do as charity. Or there's a good reason why I don't want to go to you and ask for the money I should have.
Now, let's say we pick up on some of these cues and some of these red flags, not confront the person. You don't want to tip them off, right? We should call you. And what's the best process for that?
The first question I ask people when they call me and they tell me what they're seeing is, okay, if this person is not stealing, how do you feel about them as an employee?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll get 1 or 2 answers. Somebody will say, well, if they're not stealing, they're my ideal employee, and I'm really, really, really hoping they're not. And then you get the other ones who say, they're marginal at best. Anyway, if the answer is marginal, then my suggestion is, okay, so if I tell you that they're stealing, they're going to get fired. And if I tell you that they're not stealing, they're going to get fired. And somebody says, yeah, that's right. And I say, okay, so let's start the process by firing them then, because that's the ultimate result anyway. And then we can do our investigation without you sitting there every day wondering how much they took from you today, which mentally you will find a lot easier. And our investigations typically take about 8 or 10 weeks, depending on the situation. So, I'm not going to consign you to looking at this person every morning and wondering how much of your money went out with them today. If we're talking about an ideal employee, then the approach is a little bit different. And now, what you're really hoping is that the answer is no, and you're more than prepared to put up with this situation over 8 weeks while we do our work. So I kind of start with asking that question, and that often dictates sort of what happens next. But
Mm-hmm.
you never want to go off half-cocked here. You certainly don't want to confront somebody about embezzlement. And a lot of times, if somebody's going to be fired anyway, you would just, rather than think that it's a performance issue and not that you're also suspicious about embezzlement. Because a lot of those people are the ones who would retaliate given the chance. And you just don't want to prompt that.
So what's your process with your investigation, and how do you present yourself when you show up to the office so it doesn't, raise like this big, sense of, a culture shock?
Hi, I'm here to fix the compressor. No. In this millennium, we're able to do investigations through the cloud. So we don't visit generally. I mean, there are certain cases where we need to, but for 98% plus of our investigations, we don't have to visit your office. What we do actually is we typically start by making a duplicate copy of the practice management software that's used in the practice. So if you're, let's say, a Dentrix user, what we will do is we will make a copy of your data files, and we can work with your IT people to do this if there's no concern that they might talk to your staff. If that is a concern, then what we do instead is we work directly with you. So one of my IT team will book a time with you when you can be in the practice by yourself, and they'll call you at that time and talk you through a few minutes worth of stuff so that they can upload your data files. Then we build our own copy of your software in our computer lab. So continuing my example, if you're a Dentrix user, we will have a copy of Dentrix with your data running in our lab. And when one of our investigators gets assigned, they will connect to that copy of Dentrix, and they'll have access to all of your data. So typically we're looking backward. If you call me today and say, I've got concern about, Susie, my office manager, normally what we'll do is look backward, often a year, but it could be some other period. And we're doing that in our copy of the software. So there's really no digital footprint at all of this activity. And that means that it's totally stealthy to your staff. It also means, Eric, that we get to work with static data. In other words, the copy that I will make of your software won't change. And as an investigator, when I look at something on Tuesday and I put it down and I come back on Thursday, what I want to see is everything exactly where I left it. And I'll have that in our copy of your software. I wouldn't have it in your live software because of those pesky patients who, come and go and have treatment and pay money and stuff. So for what we're trying to do, which is make sense of history, that's contamination. And our own copy is a nice forensically stable platform for us to use.
Now, are any practice management softwares safer than others? Are they all about the same as far as the opportunity?
The problem isn't the tool, it's the carpenter. Practice management software is pretty safe, and then they hand it to end users. And the end users will do all kinds of things to undermine the safety that the software company put in there. For example, I hate to think about how many staff members in most practices have the doctor's password. Mm-hmm. And the way practice management software is set up is that the top level account, the administrator account, can do anything. There really are no safeguards applicable against that administrator account. And then what is delegated to staff members is some subset of the practice owner's privileges. And that's the safety feature. When somebody has your password, they can skirt right around every safeguard that's built into the practice management software. So if we were playing Family Feud, I'd say, what's the number one answer for how staff get the doctor's password? And that answer is ask. Number two, by the way, is shoulder surfing, which means most dentists type with 2 fingers. So specialists I understand can use 3. So if I sit and watch you log in 3 or 4 times, I probably know what your password is.
Wow. Now, do dentists make the mistake of, they have red flags and they call their CPA or they call the police? What really is the best thing to call, a specialist like yourself than calling the police when you have these suspicions?
You need to call somebody who can solve the problem. And it's unlikely that your CPA could. And it's highly unlikely that the police could. When your CPA does their job, and I'm a CPA, so I don't criticize my own profession lightly, but what CPAs do typically with a practice is they work from your bank account. In other words, what goes into your bank account is revenue, and what comes out of your bank account is expenses. Very few CPAs spend any time in your practice management software or have any expertise in it at all. They simply don't need to have those things to do their work. So they're working from the bank account as being kind of their primary driver. And when you call your CPA and you say, I think somebody's embezzling from me, their instinct is to look at expenses. In other words, is somebody padding payroll? Is somebody, um, writing checks to some fictitious entity and cashing them? And a little bit of embezzlement happens that way. The overwhelming majority of embezzlement is theft of your revenue. So it's stealing incoming payments, be they cash checks, credit cards, or electronic funds transfers. And the CPA is just not of that mindset, and they're certainly not equipped to find that stuff. For the police, this is just so far above their training and sophistication. They just have no way of solving this problem. And it's not even their job. It's not their job to tell you what was stolen from you. You have to tell them that. Picture Friday night, you're at a bar somewhere, you get out, you can't find your car. And you phone the police and you say, I think somebody stole my car. And they say, sorry to hear that, Dr. Block. What's the make and model? And you say, I think it's a Ford, but it might be a Mercedes. What the police are going to say to you next is, okay, Dr. Block, here's what you do. Take an Uber home, sober up, and in the morning, if you still can't find your car, call us back.
Right.
And really what they're saying is, you have to tell us what you lost.
Yeah.
We just can't figure that out for you.
Now, let's say you let the staffer go first versus a current staffer who you're hoping isn't the suspect. But during your investigation, you can figure out who it is based off of their logins and activity. Do you tell me and then I let the staffer go and then we go from there, or how does that work?
Yeah, I'm not sure what our alternative would be. We'll just keep you guessing. Yes, we inevitably need to find out who did it.
Mhm.
And software is one avenue to that, Eric, but it's not totally reliable. In other words, if I am a thief, one of the thoughts that very quickly goes through my mind is I should be doing this under somebody else's login. Ideally the doctor's, but if I can't pull that off, maybe somebody else's. I won't necessarily use my name. What I tell a lot of dentists is we shouldn't forget that the software transactions are a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. The ultimate goal here is to put your money in my pocket. And ideally we can find that. If we can't find that, we have other avenues. For example, one of the things we often do is we correlate work schedules or vacation schedules with when the theft happens. And when you start doing that, you quickly get down to a very small group, ideally one person who is the only person who could have done all of the thefts. And what facilitates that is that most thieves prefer to be alone when they steal. So, when my coworker's on vacation is a really good time for me to do this. It's also a time when my coworker couldn't have done it.
Now, at what point do you get the police involved?
We finish our process first. So we get to the end. I mean, as soon as we confirm embezzlement, we call you, we let you know that. And if we're looking at our 8-week kind of ideal cycle, we usually spend about the first 2 weeks gathering information. So we're not looking at stuff then, we're just assembling it so that it can be handed to one of our investigators. So typically our investigator starts in about week 2 of 8, and they're on the file for ideally about 6 weeks. So, any time in there, they could be in a position to confirm embezzlement. When they do, they call you right away. They say, okay, well, here's what we found. Here's who's doing it. We'll give you some help getting them out the door if they're still with you. And then we need to go back and finish our work. Another one of my many statistics is the typical embezzler steals from you 3 different ways. So when we find one method, the instant question that arises is, what else are they doing? They all get the idea that a diversified portfolio makes sense. So they steal multiple ways. We need to find them. And then at the end, we issue our report. And that report is kind of the raw material that the police need to do their job. And actually, sometimes we don't even need the police. A lot of times, if we have sufficient information, you can go right to the district attorney and just totally skip over the police department, which will speed this process up sometimes by a year. So depending on what evidence we've been able to gather, we typically make some recommendations about whether the police have a role to play or not. And often they don't.
Do you sometimes, you're suspecting, employee A, you've done your investigation, you've concluded there's embezzlement, but then you actually, analyze the data and you found out that someone of your previous employment who left a couple of years ago had embezzled, and you catch them as well?
That may happen. We tend to be looking at a defined time period. So we're not typically looking backward to the day you installed EagleSoft in your practice 12 years ago, because that would be prohibitively expensive. So you and I are, before we start our work, you and I have agreed on what time period we're going to look at. And if we're looking at the past year, for example, there's not much chance we're going to stumble across something that would point to employee B who's been gone for 3 years. So I wouldn't expect that to happen. What we do find sometimes, though, is that you come to us with a suspect and we find out that not only are they stealing, but there's somebody else either involved collusively with them, or you have two independent thefts going on at the same time.
What do you find is more common, that they're working independently or working together?
Working alone is by far the most common.
Yeah.
Because if I want to steal from you, I'm going to take a huge risk when I go to one of my coworkers and say, I want to steal from Dr. Block and I really need your help. That's a massive risk that somebody takes when they do that. Sometimes it happens. The most common time that will happen is when that person I'm talking to and I have some kind of nexus outside of the practice. Like, for example, we're siblings, or mother and daughter, or we've known each other since grade school. But to go to a relative stranger with that proposition is pretty risky, and most people won't do that. So yes, the overwhelming majority of embezzlement is perpetrated by one person.
Okay.
But we do
Now,
collusive stuff. And the other thing we see, and I'll just throw this one out, we see a fair number of embezzlements in group practices where the person behind it has DDS or DMD after their name.
mm-hmm.
And that's one of those, things that doesn't get talked about that much.
Yeah.
Just to give you some numbers, at any point in time, typically we have about 100 or 110 active cases. So that's what we're working on now. Of those, probably normally 6 to 8 of them happen in group practices where the suspect is another doctor. In fact, I just signed off on a report. We're having this conversation on a Monday. I just signed off on a report Friday where we confirmed about $600,000 by one of the doctors in the practice.
Now, were these associates or employees versus partners?
This was a case where somebody sold some practices to a DSO and kept working there, and was stealing from the DSO.
Okay.
DSO, in case any audience member isn't familiar with the term, dental service organization. So that's one of the big companies that own multiple practices, and that was our client in this case.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, you'd think it's just a staffer, but it could also be the dentist, one of the dentists that's stealing as well. Wow.
Yeah, we assume that people who have the same level of education as you and kind of the same set of core values and so on should not steal from you. And education doesn't create honesty.
Mhm. So, what if I'm just trying to figure out, you know, how do we really, is there any way to prevent this? Like, can I just have a staff meeting and tell them, I just took a course on dental embezzlement and that would scare them? Or what can we do to really, prevent this other than, with our hiring process, checking those deposit slips and printing your own reports. What else can we do to prevent this?
Those are all good answers. If you want absolute prevention, it's very simple. Um, Go out your office door, turn off the lights, lock the door, and don't come back.
Okay.
Okay. Put your handpiece down and leave it there.
Yeah, and just retire. Yeah.
Yeah, that's foolproof. All of the things that you talked about will not prevent embezzlement, um, but they certainly tilt the odds much more in your favor than they would otherwise be. Um, the big thing I would say, other than those points you just mentioned, which are all really effective, is, and it's a hard ask for dentists, but you need to be a little bit suspicious.
Yeah.
You all live in the land of truth. And what I mean by that is a patient comes into you with a tooth that hurts and there's an underlying cost. And most of your colleagues will work pretty hard to find it. I mean, is it malocclusion that's causing that tooth to be traumatized, or does it need a root canal? And you guys have diagnosis, and the point of diagnosis is to get to the truth. And the science that you've developed over the last couple of 100 years is pretty good at getting to the bottom of what's going on in somebody's mouth. I mean, how often is it you just kind of shrug your shoulders and say, I really don't know what's causing your pain, Mrs. Smith? It's not very often. Once you step out of the clinical bubble and you start dealing with the rest of the world, now truth's a little more fuzzy. And unfortunately, the same kind of principles that make you a great clinical dentist don't work nearly as well in running your practice. And you step away from this clinical truth and you step into the realm of human behavior. And humans will lie, they will cheat, they will steal. And all the while they're doing that, they'll smile at you and nod politely and act like they think you're the greatest dentist on the planet.
And therein lies what a lot of dentists probably say, is that this could never happen to me, right?
Yeah, and I think everybody says that. The same way that if you survey 100 drivers, Eric, 70% of them will say they're above average.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's not possible. And yes, people work very hard to convince themselves that they're not going to be victimized by this. And it's interesting. If I speak to a live audience, sometimes there's somebody sitting there with their arms folded and facially they're tight. You can sometimes even see a little bruxism happening, and it all says, well, it might victimize the guy on my left and it might victimize the guy on my right, but it won't get me.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ask them why they have the immunity face on, they will say, well, I live in a small town and most of my staff used to be patients before they became my staff. And I've known them all since they wore diapers, and, it just wouldn't happen to me. Or, another one I hear a lot is, well, I pay my staff really well. And, conceptually, I've bought their honesty. Or I'm a specialist and really embezzlement is a problem for general dentists. I mean, everybody's quite capable of coming up with some kind of rationalization as to why they're safe. None of them are true. Embezzlement is not opportunity driven. It is driven because somebody who works for you feels like they have a higher entitlement to your money than you do, and they act on it. And that can happen in any practice in America.
Now, do you recommend that, we just call you and you can do an evaluation of the office, or should we really be waiting for red flags, or what do you recommend for the young dentists out there?
That's a really personal decision. I certainly welcome a conversation with any dentist who wants to get better informed about investment. And investigation is one of our products. We also have a preventive product called Office Protection System.
Mhm.
And what we do in Office Protection System is we work with you to identify the weaknesses in your practice and to help you correct them. So the idea is for you to come out with tighter systems that are more likely to protect you. And when you think about the systems in most practices, um, if you bought a practice 10 years ago and you've had 3 office managers since, you inherited some systems, and then, in conjunction with those 3 office managers, you've tweaked them 4 or 5 times. And it's almost like the person who comes into your practice and they had an amalgam filling 20 years ago and somebody's patched it 3 times. That's kind of what most practice systems are like. And nobody's ever sort of given some sober second thought
Mhm.
and stood back and say, why are we doing that? Or what should we be doing in this case? And so we have a product that really gives people the chance to rationalize their systems.
Now,
And
is that a software that?
not in the slightest.
Okay.
It is one of our very skilled, experienced people taking the time to understand what you do now and forcing you to question a little bit the logic of what you're doing. So no, it's not like some software that lurks in the background and pounces when one of your staff do something they shouldn't. I wish
Mhm.
I had that, but I don't think that would be the solution to the problem anyway. The real solution is helping you. One of the things we do, for example, is we teach you how to do a proper day end.
Mhm.
And to go back full circle to the way we started this conversation, you said we come out of school with no business training, and um, I think for most of you, your involvement in the day end process is largely a function of what your predecessor's involvement in the day
Mhm.
end process was. And that's not a really good way to run a practice.
Wow. Well, David, thank you so much for joining us. That was yeah, I'm officially not going to sleep tonight, and I'm going to stick my head in a ice bath right now. But um, thank you so much for joining us. That was extremely informative. And again, David Harris of Prosperident. You can find his promo offer on dealsfordentist.com, which is 10% fee reduction on all their services. David, any last bit of advice for those young dentists out there before we wrap things up?
Absolutely. I will quote a long deceased president of the United States who said something I thought was very wise when he said, trust, then verify.
Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, the great
Yeah.
communicator.
Yep. That's such great advice. Well, David, thanks so much. Let's be in touch.
I'd love to.
Okay, it was a pleasure.